Hi, I'm Patrick Foley from Labour Outlook, and I'm here with Clive Lewis, and we're going to be talking about the Green New Deal and the Green New Deal bill. So we'll get straight into it. Clive, can you tell us a bit more about the Green New Deal bill, its aims, what stage it's at in Parliament, and the work going on around it?
Yeah, so basically what happened in 2018, I was approached by Caroline Lucas to see whether I wanted to put together, help draft a Green New Deal bill. It's a 10-minute rule bill, and we did that when I was Minister for Sustainability, Shadow Minister for Sustainability on the Treasury team. Now, I did get in a bit of trouble by putting my name to it for a variety of reasons, for being a front bencher and doing that. But I saw in this, back in 2018, this is before, this in many ways was as Labour was beginning under Jeremy Corbyn, and Rebecca Long-Bailey and others, and John McDonnell, to kind of come to terms and grips with the climate crisis. And our policy really began to pick up speed. But this was kind of, whilst that was still an ongoing process. And I thought by involving myself with this, it would send a clear signal out there to the climate activists outside the Labour Party and inside that we were serious about this. So I kind of worked with her on that, and we did that back in 2018. Got in a little bit of trouble, but I think it was an investment worthwhile. And inside that Green New Deal bill, which was first put down in 2018, we basically tried to do what I would call create something which was a gold standard of parliamentary legislation when it came to tackling the climate crisis. And one of the things that we began to understand as we began to put this together was that actually this wasn't a bill that could exist in a department on its own. It was a bill which basically went across government. And the more that we looked at it, the more we realized it was the Treasury, it was base, it was defense, it was every single component. And as it's gone on over the years, as it's evolved, as we've put more of this down, redrafted it, we've consulted more. So we've consulted with trade unions, with the climate movement, with NGOs, with charities. It's grown to the point now when we put it down last week, we've consulted for months and months with a plethora of organizations. And what you have now is, I think, the gold standard of legislation when it comes to turning our economy onto a decarbonizing, ecologically rebuilding piece of legislation, which permeates the Bank of England, democratizes how money is spent, how debt is used, how we build up debt and how that's used. It basically has at its heart social and economic justice. In fact, the first words in there aren't about the environment; they're about economic justice. So, you know, it's a fantastic bill, and it looks at everything from economics, the Treasury, the environment, the ecology, farming, everything you would need to do to put our country onto a path dictated by the climate science. That's really important. The climate science, not the greenwash, not what business tells us is possible, not what the banks or the corporations or the oil companies tell us is possible, what the science dictates is possible and is necessary. And that's the kind of, I think, which differentiates this from the government's net zero 2050 strategy.
Very much a transformative bill, that's rather than just sort of tinkering around the edges, as we've heard a lot from the government. I mean, you touched upon
change, not climate change, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So you spoke a lot about bringing different groups in the trade unions and elsewhere and other organisations. But I also know that you're a co-founder of the Global Alliance for a Green New Deal. So obviously that there's a lot of links between internationalism and the climate fight as well. So could you tell us more about this coordinated international approach to tackling the climate crisis?
This is a really good question, Patrick. We realised pretty quickly that it doesn't make a difference what we do in this country in some ways. So clearly it does make a difference what we do here, in the sense that we need to show leadership. We're one of the world's biggest polluters, also one of the wealthiest countries. So what we do here on everything from debt cancellation, providing new renewable and green technologies to the rest of the world. All of those things matter in what we do here. And that's all in our own Green New Deal bill here in the UK Parliament. But clearly, if we're going to solve the climate crisis, it has to be done at a global level. And what we're seeing increasingly around the world is what's called greenwash, delay. And we're seeing that so frequently now. One of the things we wanted to do was to set a gold standard for the entire world. And on top of that, also begin to build a network of legislators who themselves are battling the same forces that we are here in the UK to try and get a real Green New Deal. And so we put out feelers to legislators from across the globe, particularly with a special emphasis on the Global South. The Global South is going to be disproportionately impacted, and it's where the vast majority of the world is, and it's also where so much of the growth is going to have to be required, and it has to be clean growth. I'm going to call it, I say growth, but people say, oh, we don't want to grow anymore. Well, actually, there's an issue here. What we know at the heart of the Green New Deal is inequality or equality. And one of the things we know about the climate crisis, which is causing such a challenge for our own government, is that we understand that the top 10% are consuming as much as the bottom 50% are. So the poor can't give up what they don't consume. And in fact, they need to be consuming more, perhaps up to 3 times as much, but in as much as in a sustainable way as possible. And the rich need to be consuming less than they are. And so with that in mind, you begin to see how important it is to involve the Global South in this, and also because they are the ones who are now experiencing the climate crisis firsthand in ways that many in the global north haven't today. We have flash floods and we have fires and so on, but the Global South is going to have the biggest impact and the least capability of being able to deal with that. So we need the global Green New Deal. And we've got people from Brazil, Bangladesh, Africa, the US. We've got 2 members of the squad involved, Ilhan Omar and Rashid Talib. It's an international endeavor. Yanis Varoufakis is involved. So it's a fantastic opportunity to really push this out on a global level and hold to account world leaders who are intent on talking up the talk of a Green New Deal, but not delivering. And this is saying, this is the standard that we expect, driven by the science, driven by global social and economic justice. If you fall short of this, we're going to tell you about it and we're going to let the world know. So I think it's something, because the solutions are global, we need a global Green New Deal to be able to deal with those problems.
So you're speaking about holding to world leaders account. Well, we had our own leaders here in the UK have the spending review last week, and we saw a distinct lack of climate announcements. Sunak failed to even mention the word climate in his speech. We saw tax reductions for domestic flights in the UK, which will undoubtedly lead to increased domestic travel, despite there being many more climate-friendly alternatives available. What would you say directly to Sunak about his failure to address the climate crisis when we're hosting COP next week, with just a week before COP, and we're putting out announcements like that?
I think it's not a disaster. I'd say to him, step up or step away. And clearly he needs to step away. He won't, but that's what I would say to him. Look, the eyes of the world are on the UK as we host the potentially one of the most important climate summits in the history of humankind. I mean, it's one of the most important summits in my lifetime. And, off the back of a pandemic where we've disgracefully undermined the COVAX agreement, UN agreement on distributing those vaccines to the global south. We've blocked the intellectual property rights waiver. We've shown what we do in a crisis, how we act, and we act in the interests of vested interests. And that's problematic. And this budget was true to form for the government. And I think increasingly people now can begin to see that whilst the government might talk a good talk on climate, for people who perhaps don't understand the detail of what's required, but know that something needs to happen, then you begin to see that the government is basically trying to tell those people, because people increasingly are concerned about it, is trying to say to them, we're doing something on this, don't worry. But the reality that's beginning to permeate, I think, especially after this budget, is that the government is incapable of taking that decision on ideological grounds. Now, I talked a little bit about the inequality issue. When you have a government that is there to represent the economic system as is, the vested interests that control and dominate our economy, the inequality that already permeates our society, both nationally and internationally, this concept of trickle down, that you allow the super rich to become super wealthy and money will then peter down to the rest of us. When you understand that, then you understand how inimical it is for this government to be able to make the system changes required to put not just this country, but to show the leadership to the world about the kind of dramatic changes we need to see take place, the systematic changes we need to take place across the planet. So this, in some ways, I'm not pleased what Rishi Sunak has done, but I think the battle lines have been drawn. Because when I was in a debate on the government's net zero targets this week, there were two types of Tory. There were the government MPs who I think in their own minds want to do something about the climate crisis, but want to kind of buy into that greenwash. And they're kind of talking the language, but they're not prepared to do what's needed. And then you've got the others in the government, on the government side, who are hostile to making the changes that need to happen. And in some ways, I prefer dealing with them, because you know what you're fighting. You can see that they are like, we don't care about the climate crisis. It's happening elsewhere. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We just have to crack on with what we're doing. And I can fight that easier than I think we can fight that easier than we can fight the greenwash. And in some ways, that budget blew away any notion this government was serious about tackling the climate crisis. And I think in some ways, we in the climate movement who are fighting for that better world can better target an opposition, our opponents, if they are being quite clear they're not interested in tackling this properly. And so I thought, that budget ultimately, I mean, let's take, for example, the issue of air passenger duty. I mean, at what level do you tackle the climate crisis by giving a handout to airports and reducing the cost of airplane travel, when we know that 70% of flights are taken by about 15% of the population, often in the wealthiest end of the spectrum? It's completely sends the wrong message, and it shows that they're not serious. So no, I thought it was disappointing, but not surprising.
Right. So yeah, I agree with that. Definitely disappointing, not surprising. So you mentioned the battle lines being drawn, and for the climate fight, and with COP taking place next week. How do you think that climate activists and those who support the Green New Deal and the Green New Deal bill, how do you think they can organise around COP so that these ideas are really brought to the forefront of the discussion and can't be ignored?
Yeah, I think it's really important. A couple of things. Climate activists, those concerned about the climate, and that has to, increasingly now that's the general public, have to do a couple of things. One, you cannot rely on us, the politicians, to deliver this in Parliament or in many of the institutions in place. There is at the heart of the climate crisis is a crisis of democracy. And I think, when we can look at literally any major issue confronting this country, whether on COVID and how we dealt with that, on the climate crisis, on economic inequality, there are just so many areas where there is a lack of democratic engagement, where we as the public have a real say, have sovereignty over the decisions taken by large pension companies, over the decisions taken by oil companies, over the decisions taken by our own government, by local authorities, by large institutions, by the NHS. What we're seeing in the NHS, for example, is we are now, in this new legislation that's going through, we're going to see more and more of the NHS, of the powers of the NHS, of decision-making, handed to corporations. So there is a crisis of democracy. If we want to decarbonize the NHS, we won't be able to deal with it. We won't be able to instruct them to do that. It would increasingly be in the hands of corporations who may not want that. They'll want to generate profits rather than tackle the climate crisis. So the issue here at the heart of this is a crisis of democracy. And so my message to the public, to climate activists, is don't rely on politicians, on the political structures that already exist to change that. You're going to have to do that yourself. And that means by organizing, by protest, and by educating, not just yourselves, but others in your workplace, in the organizations you engage with. The more that people understand the science of the climate crisis and what it's going to take and the time that we have to do that, I think that sense of urgency needs to percolate into the general public. People are already almost there, but once they understand that what's being put forward by the government and by big business. I was in the cinema the other week watching June, which I heartily recommend to anyone who's interested, not just in science fiction, but in the climate as well. There's a lot of climate messages in there. There was an advert, and it was this fantastic advert with these kids from around the world demanding action on the climate. And at the very end of it, in this packed cinema, everyone was like, yeah, this is really good. I could see people like watching it. This is really good. And at the end, it came up, sponsored by Amazon. And there was this collective groan across the entire audience. And the guy next to me was swearing, what the hell, and I think people get at an instinctive level that there is now a large degree of greenwash, and there is a large degree of trying to sell environmentalism through consumerism, and the two are in many ways incompatible. So I guess my long-winded answer is don't rely on politicians and the already eroded institutions within our society and economy to make that change. We're going to have to demand it. We're going to have to educate ourselves, and we're going to have to bring the public along with us, civil society along with us, to force that change. Because the timescales now we're talking about are so small to be able to make effective changes in the window we have. So organize, educate, agitate.
Thank you, Clive. If I could just get you just for sort of some closing thoughts on where next for the Green New Deal bill, and how are you going to be promoting it and getting as many people on board for it as possible, and what we as individual activists can do to help you in that fight?
It's a fantastic question. So I think the first thing is sign up to the Green New Deal bill. Sign up for getting information. So Green New Deal Rising, which is spearheading the kind of climate movement at the moment. It's sprung up from the youth climate strikes. And that's now, I think, one of the kind of key partners for the Green New Deal bill. So it's called Green New Deal Rising. They've got lots of activities planned in the coming weeks, months, and years. They're the ones who are going around doorstepping party leaders and MPs to say, what are you doing? Why haven't you signed the Green New Deal bill? So sign up for that. Sign up to Green New Deal Rising. Sign up to our newsletter from the Green New Deal bill. I've put some out myself. I've got my own email platform, which we're sending out to people. Sign up, find out what's going on, find out what the activities are, keep yourself informed. I think that's the first thing. Secondly, organize locally, get a Green New Deal group up and running. Work out what activists are there, how you can work together. Make this cross-party. I'm someone who believes that the climate crisis means we can't sit in our own tribal silos. We've got to work with others. There will be Liberal Democrats who are concerned about the environment. There will be Greens who are concerned about the environment. And there are people in the Labour Party, and there will be people who are not politically aligned. We need to work together. This is a kind of big emergency. We need to get together and work together on that. So it's cross-party lines, cross the lines of tribalism that normally confine us to do that. Make sure that your own CLP is fully on board with the Green New Deal bill. If you're fortunate enough to have a Labour MP, make sure that they've signed up to either the global Green New Deal legislators, and there's a statement that they need to agree with. It's a very open-ended, broad statement about social and economic justice and the environment. Get them to sign up to that. Get them to sign the Green New Deal bill. Put a little bit of pressure on them. And this sounds a little bit left field, but also start pushing on getting them to support PR. And why this is important is because increasingly, I talked about the crisis of democracy. One of the problems we've got is that to unlock so much more of our country's democracy, we need a voting system where everyone's vote counts and which is fair and which makes MPs and our parliamentarians accountable to the public. And the first past the post doesn't do that. And it's one of the underlying problems of why our democratic institutions in this country and our democracy isn't working. It's not the only one, it's not a silver bullet, but it is an important one. And so I think that democracy angle and the PR angle is very important, as is a constitution, but one thing at a time. So I think make sure you're informed, sign up to the various emails that are out there for information. I think the other thing as well is take part in the demonstrations, help bill for the demonstrations that are taking place on the 6th of November in recognition of the COP Climate Act event that's taking place in Glasgow. Get involved with that, help make them big so that when people turn on the news on the 6th of November, they see that there are hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, out on the streets making their voices heard. That's something that people can bill for really easily. Other than that, carry on doing what you're doing, carry on campaigning the way that you are, but try to network as much as possible and to build alliances with others who are also doing that. And show some leadership, which I think just by listening to this, watching this, engaging with this, you are, and spread that word.
Thank you very much for joining us, Clive.
Thank you.